Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining. I'll just give it a couple more seconds to let people join the webinar before we begin. Great, okay, it looks like people have logged on now. So hello everyone. On behalf of the Northwest Territories Council on Invasive Species, Pests and Pathogens, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for the third in our series of webinars to celebrate National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Today we are excited to have a talk on aquatic invasive species presented by Nicole Kimmel. So Nicole Kimmel is the Aquatic Invasive Species Specialist from Alberta Environment Parks, and her presentation will give an overview of Alberta's Aquatic Invasive Species Program and how the program strives for prevention. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Nicole, and you can get started.
Thank you, and thanks for giving me this opportunity. I know anybody that works in aquatic invasive species never really works alone in their efforts. So we work hard to keep Northwest Territories also free of any aquatic invasive species we happen to intercept in any travelers that are coming through us, from us to you. So just to dive into the program, you know, if anything has been highlighted from COVID-19 is that we are really connected on a worldwide scale, and this resonates with the public now after COVID-19, but we've been pushing this idea ever since we started on invasive species, that things move around very quickly and readily throughout the world. So our program really basically became because of these two threats. So the zebra mussel and the quagga mussel has really driven our program. Most of our legislation and program efforts have been with this priority species in mind. But after we started setting up around these species, we recognized that there was other species outside of that. So this is the poster child for our program, but we do delve into other species as well. And it doesn't take very much to actually defend a program around the invasive mussels because their impacts are pretty wide scale. Any users of water will feel the impacts of the invasive mussels. And this just shows quagga mussels from Lake Mead, Nevada, after 6 months of that PVC pipe or ABS pipe being placed into the water body. So they do attach to hard surfaces and can very greatly impact infrastructure. Through our program, we've been tracking where our boats are coming from when they come into Alberta, and it is obvious that our neighboring provinces and states are probably our biggest visitors just because of the near distances they can travel to come and enjoy Alberta. But this really highlights the data from our inspections that we are getting boats from every state and province across the Canada and US. So we are getting boats from a pretty wide, broad viewpoint. And we don't have to look far to see that the invasive mussels will have a pretty dramatic impact. We work closely with Manitoba under their Lake Winnipeg infestation that didn't happen that long ago. They are now dealing with the shells washing ashore. These Christmas lights happen to drop into the water off a boat. And we're quickly encrusted with mussels. And then the pictures on the right-hand side there is a commercial fishing boat that was pulled out for the winter season from Lake Winnipeg and is fairly encrusted with mussels on the bottom as well. Nothing talks to the legislative folks better than money. So we did some economics back in 2013. We have tweaked this a little bit since, but it's pretty much par on with what it was previously. And it came out that any significant invasive mussel infestation in Alberta is basically going to cost us $75 million a year in maintenance costs. And this is right on par with what Ontario is spending a year addressing some of their invasive mussels infestations. So we feel like this is a pretty realistic viewpoint for if we were to get a pretty healthy population of mussels in Alberta. So this really speaks to spending a little bit on prevention to avoid this significant impact if we were to get mussels. So this is the distribution of the invasive mussels as it stands just earlier this year. The USGS does a really good job of tracking those populations. There's always new dots to this map, unfortunately, so everyone is trying to prevent these as much as possible. They are priority species across the nation, but things slip through and prevention does fail despite our best efforts, and there's always new dots to be added to this map, unfortunately. You might notice that we have a pretty good stronghold in the Northwest. Many of the states have been able to keep that prevention line, and then us three Western provinces, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, as well as the territories have also guaranteed that prevention so far. Alberta government is really concerned about invasive mussels, and up until right now, we have no open water lake treatments. So if we were to get invasive mussels detected in one of our lake water bodies, we don't have any tools at our disposal to actually launch a response. So the Alberta government has initiated the registration of potash, normally used as a fertilizer, but it is 100% effective on adult mussels and killing them. This is a treatment that they tried to attempt in Lake Winnipeg, but they weren't actually able to treat the entire lake. So Alberta government is registering this product as a pesticide, but for the benefit of all of Canada. So we're footing the bill, but really recognize that if anyone has access to this tool to eliminate the invasive mussels in a location, it does help Alberta's efforts in prevention. So we're really taking this on for all of Canada to be able to use it if need be. But we haven't got this fully registered. It is with the federal government under review for full registration as a pesticide. So outside of that, I just wanted to highlight some of the weird and wacky things that we come across. So our program is driven by the invasive mussels, but there's always something new and unexpected that comes across that we try and deal with as best we can, given our pieces of legislation and our workforce that we have. So we have had tilapia, normally an aquaculture species, dumped in our lake system or river systems, and we found this just a couple years ago. Somebody took tilapia and apparently tried to introduce them illegally into one of our river systems. They all died because of the shock to the cold water, but we are concerned by what they were trying to hide. Why did they introduce them? Was there a disease that could have affected our native fish? We don't know exactly what all happened, but we did find quite a few tilapia that were tried to be dumped. We were involved in a report from the Calgary International Airport that Chinese mitten crab were intercepted. They were declared as TV lights, obviously not TV lights. So we worked with them, found out that we had no jurisdiction because we don't have crabs on our prohibited list, but did find that federal legislation did apply on this species. So we did work with them to work through who had jurisdiction on this species. We've had stowaway things come across on this snail came through on some nursery stock from the United Kingdom, managed to avoid all the inspections that had undergone and came and was purchased by somebody in the Calgary area and taken home with them. They found the snail, kept it for a while, it started reproducing and having babies. They got concerned, and then they surrendered the snail to us, and we still have it as an office pet. So now we have 15 snails. It probably went overwinter in Alberta, so it's not a major concern, but this snail is causing problems in BC in some of those warmer climates. So an invasive species nonetheless. We are also dabbling in some native species that are unnaturally expanding in range. This is the northern crayfish. We believe that folks have been transporting these across the province wider than they would normally disperse, either using them for live bait or just wanting to establish them closer to home. Even though this is a native species, we do treat it like a pest species because it is so widespread and quite prolific in some of the areas that it has established. So we've made some legislation adjustments to allow for harvest, trying to keep it at bay. A giant African land snail made its way from Hawaii all the way to Alberta. Somebody collected this shell and thought it would be a good token from the trip until it started crawling across the coffee table. So they did surrender it to us. We actually needed a federal permit, but we did keep it as an office pet until it passed away as well. So this is how easily things are moved around. This is an American bullfrog. The University of Alberta was doing some research on some tadpoles. They got a shipment of tadpoles, and there was one weird off type. They reared it to try and figure out what it was, and it turned out to be an American bullfrog. Very invasive down in the US, probably wouldn't overwinter here, so we have low concerns about it, but it does prove how quickly things can get introduced into Alberta. And then the showstopper is an octopus. This came through some of our social media channels a few years ago. We weren't actually able to confirm that this species was what type of octopus. We were just shared the picture, but based on the picnic table and the snow in the background, we believe that it probably did get pulled out of Lake McGregor, which is out by Calgary area. So octopuses are saltwater and would probably never survive in our freshwater, but somebody tried to get that to establish. So this is really what we're up against. Folks aren't very aware of the impacts of their actions on most cases. So that's kind of an overview of some of the things we're dealing with, but I wanted to dive into our program, specifically in some of the elements. We operate 5 elements to support our Aquatic Invasive Species program, and I'll just run through these all these elements pretty quickly. So policy and legislation, education outreach, monitoring. The inspections is the watercraft inspections, which also entails decontamination and canine unit. And then when all that else fails, we actually do get it. So just quickly highlighting some policy and legislation pieces. We did have some legislation coverage prior to 2015, but we only had 2 species. Listed in that program because we overhauled our legislation, the Fisheries Alberta Act in 2015. And that's where we expanded our prohibited list to include 52 species, which includes plant, fish, and invertebrates. We made our watercraft inspections mandatory, but prior to that, it was just a voluntary basis. Now you have to stop, and if you don't, we can actually fine you. And we enhanced our authorities for quarantine. So now we can lock a boat to a trailer if we feel that there's a significant threat of introducing aquatic invasive species, and we can quarantine water bodies when an AIS is found as well. We've been building on legislation since our act was overhauled in 2015. We've added some regulations in 2016 that made pulling the bilge pug when transporting a boat mandatory. Carrying around that standing water from one water body to another is very high risk behavior. So Alberta joined many other jurisdictions that have taken this route to try and prevent the transfer of species through that water. And so pull the plug came into full force in 2016. And we also recognize that the sooner we know about an aquatic invasive species, the better we are set to actually respond to it. So we made reporting of any of those 52 prohibited species mandatory. If you come across them, you have only 14 days to tell us. And that would set us up for a really good quick response and potentially eradicate and control the species. Prior to 2018, any fines we were laying underneath our legislation, we actually had to go to court to defend it. Officers were worried about that draw on their time to court. So much like a speeding ticket, we wanted to institute some common fines to alleviate the court system as well. So now in 2018 and since, we now have a fine of $324 if you bypass an open watercraft inspection station with a watercraft, and $180 fines for failing to pull the plug when you're transporting a boat. And so we do have a yearly tally of both enforcements where we actually lay these fines, and then we continue to give out warnings depending on the officer. But we've been doing a lot of education, so we're shifting more to being enforcing rather than warnings for the most part. Outside of that, we have some policy pieces. We have an early detection rapid response plan. Anytime we get notified of a new species, we do pull up this plan, and it basically step-by-step guides us on how we're going to respond. Other partners can see how they fit into our response. We never work in isolation as a government. We are always working with the local or the regional partners that are also affected to ensure that it's a unified collaborative response effort. So this is a public document, but we've been using it in draft prior to 2019. And it seems like every year we're pulling out this document because we have an emergency response on one species or another. The next policy piece is a decontamination protocol. This is really driven by whirling disease. So whirling disease was detected in Alberta, the first jurisdiction in Canada to report this disease. We worked with Canadian Food Inspection Agency because it is a reportable disease, and there basically is no containment or control options. We're basically just trying to prevent the spread. So through that, we really joined and did the clean, drain, dry, which we were already promoting through our watercraft inspection program. But this protocol makes it mandatory. So we've actually integrated into approvals or contracts for anybody working in or near water that they actually have to undertake some of these clean, drain, dry practices. And it's basically a condition in their approval for their work. So that has helped alleviate some of this spread for whirling disease, as well as any of the other aquatic invasive species that have broken through our prevention efforts. Moving on to the next pillar is education outreach. We basically have two programs, the Clean, Drain, Dry Your Gear and the Don't Let It Loose. Both of these campaigns are really about moving beyond just awareness of an issue and actually making the public do an action. So we're actually telling the public members what we want them to do. We want them to clean, drain, dry their gear every time they're leaving the water body. And we want public members to never let anything loose, whether it be from the aquarium, the live garden, water garden trade, or live food. And we did start out in 2013 with just a clean, drain, dry your boat. Boat was our biggest vector for the invasive mussels. And we started off with this and have a whole series of support tools trying to reach customers or participants. So we have stickers and keychains and quick fact cards and signs and you name it, we've probably bought it at one point in time or not. But we expanded this with the whirling disease to clean, drain, dry your gear. So now everything we do has the gear versus just the boat portion. So here's some more of our other newer items regarding the gear part. And then the Don't Let It Loose, we had developed our own logo on the left-hand side. That's our Alberta Don't Let It Loose. Just last year, though, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans adopted a national Don't Let It Loose logo, and that's the one on the right. The goldfish can be switched out for 4 other species, whether it's sport fish, bait fish, plants, or live food with a crab. So we can switch out that image, but all elements remain the same, and it's all about the intentional release of things from those industries. So you might think you're just dumping a goldfish, but look in the water, you can see the silhouettes of many other species. You actually don't know what you could be releasing. So this is our campaign really targeting the intentional releases of things. We have a pocket guide. It's like a 4-inch by 3-inch little field guide. We're hoping folks have this on their dash. It does cover all our 52 prohibited species, as well as some other additional common species of concern like goldfish or Prussian carp, as well as some fish diseases that are on the radar. And so this is just our attempt to build awareness so that folks are more familiar with some of the things that we're on the lookout for, because we can't be everywhere in the province, and there are some really keen Albertans that are helping support our program and share what they find on a regular basis that actually helps guide our monitoring efforts. Education outreach, we have a pretty lengthy established presence. We did trade shows prior to COVID-19. We work with partners. They spread our message as well. But since COVID-19, we've really just relied on social media, but we still have a pretty good presence there. This is, the National Invasive Species Awareness Week, and we have a series of posts going out, and that's why I'm here speaking with you today, is because of that week and awareness and building awareness for the Northwest Territories as well. So no shortage of interactions with public. Even our inspection stations is a really good point of having a one-on-one discussion with a potentially high-risk pathway user. So moving on to the next pillar, monitoring. So we do monitor for zebra and quagga mussels through actually doing water towing samples, and that's looking for the villagers. Those are highlighted by the arrows. You can see them only underneath the microscope under polarized light. And so we get to about just under 70 water bodies every year, and we try and rotate every summer to get to different lake water bodies. So we have a pretty good confidence around Alberta not having any invasive mussels. We have other partners that also deploy these substrates, which is the PVC pipe filled with concrete tied to a rope. They're basically pulling out that rope, checking for anything that's attached. Any attached mussel is an invasive mussel. Our native mussels don't attach, so we can, do some pretty easy monitoring just with these concrete PVC pipe samples. And then they report back to us what they're finding. If they find anything weird and slimy that they don't know, we try working with them to make sure that it isn't anything of concern. In our water sampling, we can also look for spiny water flea at the same time. So we get kind of two kind of species for the work of just doing one. So far we have been negative for both zebra and quagga mussels as well as spiny water flea, and other jurisdictions are dealing with more and more occurrences of the spiny water flea. So Winnipeg, or Manitoba, I mean, is also dealing with new sites of mussels, the zebra mussel, as well as spiny water flea. So they're preventing Alberta Lake Management Society. So they go out to lakes and are doing water monitoring for other efforts under the government, and they just pull samples of milfoil. So we do have a northern native milfoil, and this Eurasian one is the one that's concerning. BC does have Eurasian water milfoil, and we have intercepted chunks of it coming in on boats. So in the last couple of years, we really prioritized trying to find out if we actually had Eurasian water milfoil. So far, all negative, but all it takes is just a chunk of this plant to actually be introduced into a water body and start a new population. So we're trying to be diligent on Eurasian water milfoil, but it is just one province away, so it does keep us up and at night worrying about it. Outside of that, we have the Alberta Invasive Species Council is working to lead the EdMaps online and smartphone application. So this is kind of a North American-wide initiative. Only Alberta and Ontario have really adopted EdMaps so far, but it is growing in popularity. It has the capacity to show positive and negative reports, as well as you can actually track the control efforts on some items as well. So just showing you our efforts on zebra mussel specifically here. So obviously blue is all negative. We have a couple hundred reports that shows we don't have zebra mussels in Alberta. In contrast, I'll show you flowering rush plant. And we're basically winning. If you look at the numbers here, we have thousands in the South Saskatchewan Bow River water systems down in southern Alberta. And this one is a challenge to address, and I will touch a little bit on it later, but you can see on this map that the green indicates some eradicated sites as well. So it is possible to eradicate, but it's very, very difficult. So we have plenty of flowering rush. Next up, we have watercraft inspections. This is where we run the roadside watercraft inspection stations. They will start usually in March, but this year's a little bit off year. We'll be starting just this weekend, so we're a little bit delayed. Last year, we had plans for 6 watercraft inspection stations, prioritizing the southern border as well as the eastern border. The ones to the south actually never operationalized because the international border was never open due to COVID. So we were ready to, though, if it ever happened. So we're basically doing the same program this year. We have probably likely lost the Del Bonita, the one in the middle on the south, but all the other stations probably will remain for this year. Priority being those eastern boats coming from Manitoba and Ontario. That seems to be the priority numbers that we're getting in our inspections. That's where all our mussel-fowl boats seem to be concentrated from coming. And then the southern one because of the southern US states coming up into Alberta as well. I just wanted to give you a snapshot of what we're actually finding in our inspection efforts. So it's never really an obviously mussel encrusted boat. Our inspections are finding basically a handful of mussels, and they're usually in the nooks and crannies of boats. So our inspectors are fairly well educated in training and what to look for, and these can get pretty tiny. Just to give you an example of what we're pulling off on a boat, the picture there with the nickel, that's showing all the mussels that we found on one boat. So it's not a whole lot. I think there's only about maybe just under 10 in that picture, and most of them are pretty small. So we are looking in all those nooks and crannies, and some of them can be pretty challenging to find, but our inspectors are well educated to intercept these boats. Here's our efforts in numbers on the watercraft inspection side. We piloted our program in 2013, where we started, with one station and kind of dabbled in what we needed to do in order to run one of these stations. And then we started ramping up efforts. And then in 2015, that's when our legislation passed, and we got a huge injection and really took off with our program. But we have ebbed and flowed with all our budgets and resources. But last year was a record-breaking year. We intercepted 30 mussel-fowl boats, the highest number we've ever done. since the inception of our program, and that was only operating 3 stations on the eastern side of the border. So shows you what is still at risk, despite people not moving around. Once inspections are completed, our efforts are not done. We do decontaminate any boat of high risk or mussel-fowl. So we work with them to organize a location, and then we work and use hot water as at high temperature or high pressure or low pressure, depending on the areas. And then we are in there checking with a heat gun to make sure that those temperatures are reached for the duration that we need to render everything dead after. So an extensive effort. We have a dedicated decontamination specialist as well as technicians operating this program as well. Next up, we have our canine efforts. We actually have 3 canine dogs that help support our watercraft inspection program. They're also trained to do shoreline inspections, so they do rotate through some water bodies as well, sniffing along the shorelines to see if there's any detections of, they can either detect adult mussels or the villagers, the larval stage in water as well. And everyone loves a dog, so we get a really good positive interaction with public members. They usually are happy to see the dogs and interact, and even if they have to sit there and wait for an inspection, they're happy to do so when the dogs are there, more so than the humans. And so here's all 3 of them. We have Hilo, the black lab, Zeus, the German shepherd, and Diesel is the chocolate lab in the bottom. So they are trained for either adult or the villager mussels, and we are training them on other targets. So the picture on the bottom is an invasive plant. It's really hard to see. We're training them to find a plant. They're also supporting some of our wild boar efforts in Alberta as well, when they can be used in off season. So throughout the winter, they're sometimes looking for the scat of wild boar to help find new locations of wild boar. Next up on our pillars, when all those efforts of prevention fail, then sometimes we are drawn into response to minimize impact. So in response, we have a 24 hours, 7 days a week hotline. It piggybacks on our Report a Poacher. So our Report a Poacher hotline is the same operators. Report a Poacher gets about 15,000 calls a year in Alberta, and our Aquatic Invasive Species is like 500. So we're just piggybacking on their operators, and we encourage any public member, other jurisdictions like provinces or territories or states, the Canadian Border Services Agency also uses this number. Our watercraft inspectors use this number if they ever have an issue and need an officer to help support some of their efforts. The operators can triage, take down the information, and dispatch an officer if needed. So we're really thankful that we have access to this, and calls and reports have been increasing every year slightly. So we're building capacity, and people know what to do when they find something. And it's all about early detection and rapid response to aquatic invasive species. Outside of that, I wanted to dive into some of the specific species that we've dealt with. So we've dealt with some black bullhead. This is one of our cap in our feathers, or feathers in our cap, because it's a good success story. This was the perfect aligning of legislation, both federally and provincially. In 2015, we detected black bullhead up by Fort McMurray. So we suspect that somebody took a breeding pair of black bullhead, potentially from Eastern Canada, could have been from the US as well, and then drove them all the way up to the Fort McMurray and introduced them into a stocked pond there. We detected their presence and identified them and quickly isolated the water body, and the legislation had all aligned and allowed for us to do a response. And we were able to go in there, do a chemical treatment with rotenone to eradicate the black bullhead. And we monitored for 2 years to ensure that we were successful. We never found any more black bullhead, so we were able to restock that pond. And now we basically have eradicated black bullhead from Alberta because we just had that one location. So this is a really good success story of it is possible to eradicate something if you do catch it early enough and it's in an isolated water body. The next success story I want to share that just happened recently is the moss balls. So this trickled in to Canada from reports out of the US. Alberta was able to action response fairly quickly, and so we got out to a distributor that had over 2,000 moss balls. And so moss balls are actually an algae, the green ball there in that aquarium. And they found zebra mussels were contained in those balls. So we were actually able to confirm for Canada that this was affecting Canada as well. And then all other provinces and territories were actioning response efforts on this species as well. So it was a really quick, swift action. We basically were able to remove over 2,500 moss balls from distribution in Alberta alone. We confirmed that we found 41 invasive mussels, adults, as well as some other unknown snail species we have yet to identify, but the threat was real, and it'll be interesting to see what we can leverage from this experience. Flower and rush, I had alluded to that winning map on distribution were multiple locations in Alberta. This was a pond plant that was allowed to be sold. I don't know why. I wish it hadn't. It would have caused so much less grief for me, but that wasn't the case. So now I'm trying to address it in lakes, rivers, creeks, stormwater management ponds, irrigation canals, golf course hazards. It's in just about every water body type in the province. So it's a tricky one to address, very aggressive, outcompetes all other native vegetation. So we're trying to get in and do a pretty large scale herbicide treatment, but we do try and dig it up if we can get it early enough in just one isolated location. But that's usually not the case. Usually it's not noticed until it's a huge, large scale population, unfortunately. But we are working towards getting rid of this from Alberta, from some locations. Another plant is invasive Phragmites. We're really learning from Eastern Canada that we need to pay attention to this species and not ignore it. Unfortunately, Ontario and Manitoba, for a couple of examples of jurisdictions that have ignored it, and now they're dealing with thousands of acres of this invasive Phragmites. And so our biggest vector that we've seen is railway lines. We found it along railway lines in just a few isolated populations. So we're working with the Canadian National Railway as well as in the Canadian Pacific Railway, trying to make sure that they are staying on top of those populations in their right of ways. And so far we've had pretty good support. We've had other locations show up along major highways as well. So transportation corridors seems to be the biggest vector for the invasive Phragmites. And it's complicated because we have a native one as well. The native one, it doesn't dominate stands like the invasive one. So we do rely on DNA to tell them apart. So we have that lab capacity built within the province as well. Purple loosestrife is a pretty common plant that everyone is fairly familiar with. It's a pretty good poster child of invasive plant species. We had a huge program with Ducks Unlimited in the 90s in Alberta, where we did a huge eradication attempt. We did remove a significant portion from Alberta, but the funding ran out in the late 1990s. And we actually were holding, but a few populations within Alberta are coming back now. So we are trying to keep purple loosestrife at bay for the most part. And this is more of a wetland species that really dominates. So we're trying to keep it out as much as possible, but it's still there. Another ornamental that we're dealing with is pale yellow iris. This is actually a poisonous plant that folks are usually unaware of, and they try and bring it home with them. Once it's introduced into a little wet, low-lying area, it can dominate. So the picture on the left there, that's a golf course, water pond basically, and it's now that it was introduced, it is lined that water body where there hasn't been any barriers or retaining walls, so it's quite prolific. And we have no chemical options on this one, but we can smother it for 3 months, and that seems to take it out. So we're working with the few locations we have to smother it out. Chinese mystery snail was a new detection in late of 2019, and it's the only known occurrence in Alberta. So we're working to contain it because we have no control or eradication measures. And there are a few locations in BC, and our location radiates out from a boat launch, so we suspect that a boat actually introduced it into Alberta as well. So working on some containment measures, basically prescribing clean, drain, dry practices have to be implemented when you leave the one location that the snails have established, and working on some impacts around what does this snail mean for Alberta in the food webs, as well with some collaboration efforts with the University of Alberta. Moving outside of our prohibited list, we are also dealing with Prussian carp. So unfortunately, Alberta is the first jurisdiction in North America to be dealing with Prussian carp. I don't know what it was, but for whatever reason, Alberta is the only one between the US and Canada that was initially introduced with Prussian carp. We suspect that it might have been introduced through goldfish. Looks a lot like goldfish. It's actually in the same genus as goldfish, but has a different species. So we think that somebody had a goldfish, it was actually a Prussian carp, and released it, and now we're dealing with thousands of Prussian carp. This fish can use something called gynogenesis, is where it uses the sperm of other cyprinid, the same family fish, to actually initiate their egg development, but it actually doesn't fertilize. And it kicks up the DNA contributions, but it triggers the egg to start, and they will actually make clones of themselves through this process. So even with just one fish being introduced has really threatened Alberta waterways. And we have 4 watersheds that are fairly heavily impacted, with a handful of locations that are dealing with thousands of Prussian carp. And now we have shared it with Saskatchewan through some of our connecting waterways, unfortunately. So they're also joining our fight. Basically, all we have on this one is basically catch it and kill it and dispose of it properly. We can't use any chemical because it will take out all our other fish. And netting and electrofishing doesn't seem to be very effective as well. So really trying to ramp up efforts, but there's not a lot to go on this one. Much like the Prussian carp, it's very related to the goldfish. We still have people dumping goldfish as well. We get new reports every year. So far, Alberta is dealing with over 70 locations of goldfish being introduced, mostly into the stormwater management ponds in urban areas. But most of these ponds are designed to drain into our natural waterways. So we are starting to now get reports in lakes and rivers as well that goldfish are there as well. They will start out gold, like the picture on the tote lid here shows, but once they start reproducing in the wild, they start to lose their orange coloration, and then they look a lot like the Prussian carp. Very opportunistic fish. They will keep growing. We've pulled out goldfish like the size of a dinner plate, over 1 foot long. They do grow quite extensively. The same can be said about koi. So much like goldfish, we have intercepted a few populations of koi where people have dumped them as well. They do get a lot bigger than the goldfish. Some have been caught at 16 or 18-pound fish. Pretty impressive, but yeah, much like the goldfish, a tricky species to respond to when we're dealing with other fish. So that's sort of the highlight of the main species that Alberta's working on. I just wanted to highlight some more work for aquatic invasive species poor behaviors that we're still trying to minimize or, educate folks on. So we still deal with a lack of poor or no clean, drain, dry practices. So we still encounter boat trailers that look like this, where there's hanging with vegetation. Folks are pulling their plugs, but maybe not in the best location. So this boat has pulled their plug. It is draining into that drainage system. That's not what we're looking for. We want that water to be isolated and trickling through, gravel or soil before it actually meets up with water to minimize the transfer. We're still working with folks to make sure that they're pulling the plug. Despite that legislation requiring pulling the bilge plug, we still have folks transporting boats with the plug in. So we're trying to encourage those behaviors as well. We're still dealing with live transfer. The moss balls was kind of a new angle on that, but we are looking at the watercraft inspection boats, bringing in those mussels attached to the surfaces. But we're also dealing with, for example, this pictures on the left are northern crayfish that were being transported in a bucket alive. Who knows where they were going, but thankfully our officers were able to confiscate and they were actually charged for having the live crayfish in this case just last year. So still happens. We're still trying to mitigate this as much as possible. There are pretty substantial fines. Individuals can be charged up to $100,000 when they're caught live transferring things. Any corporations would be up to $500,000. So pretty significant fines showcasing like these are serious impacts from these behaviors. So. And then we're still seeing evidence of intentional release, getting more and more goldfish reports. These set of pictures were caught by me. I was actually doing some fly and rush inspections and happened to walk across some decorative rocks along the banks of this irrigation canal. The only thing I can think of is somebody seriously went down there with their aquarium with their decorative rocks and dumped the aquarium, and those rocks were left behind. So who knows what's in the irrigation canal that connects to the lake in this particular water body, but I'm sure I'll find it in a couple years. So really trying to make connections that so people understand the impacts. It's not as innocent as just dumping your goldfish. There are some serious impacts from those behaviors. And then just in wrapping up, I just wanted to say that, creative partnerships tackle aquatic invasive species in Alberta. I'm one person, so I'm the specialist. I have support from folks running the inspection side of programming, but I basically beg, borrow, steal, whatever I can manage to implement all those pillars of our program so that we can have the best chance possible of minimizing effects of things that are here and work on preventing the things that aren't and keep it that way. So with that, I'll take any questions from anybody in the audience. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. Here's my contact information if you have anything specific that you don't want to discuss here. I'm usually pretty easily accessible and happy to discuss anything. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole, for that great presentation. Yeah, I'll just welcome folks to enter their questions into the question and answer chat box so that I can give them to Nicole. We've got a couple here already. Well, one of them is a comment. Somebody really liked your slides on all the random kind of invasive species that you've intercepted, like the octopus. That was wild. Yeah. And then another question, can you commit to sharing the results of the snails that were found on the moss balls? The NWT confirmed mussels on moss balls sold locally in Yellowknife.
Yeah, and I think, so the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is the one that's supporting the identification of some of those snails because we don't have the capacity here. For sure, yeah, I'm sure we will be sharing those results probably with you, Joanna, and then maybe you can spread it broader than that.
Yeah,
Through some of our communications on the mossball response. Yeah.
absolutely. That would be great. Another question. Do you use DNA water sampling tests for presence absence?
So we're not relying on DNA right now. All of our water sampling for the mussels is done with microscopy, the polarized light. So under a microscope, we're looking at and using polarized light to see those villagers of the mussels. So right now we're not relying on DNA, but we are starting to initiate discussions with academia to maybe undertake some projects for the DNA. Outside of that, the DNA is being used to confirm invasive plants. So we use it to confirm the Eurasian water milfoil as well as the invasive Phragmites from other plant species that are closely related. But nothing on the environmental DNA side, we're not using that just yet.
Okay. Great. Go. Another question here. How do you deal with potentially invasive species sold through mail order?
Yeah, so mossballs really identified this as a huge issue, and we knew that it was coming. We had seen some things. Actually, just last month, we confiscated European water chestnut off Facebook Marketplace. That's actually a prohibited species in Alberta. So we do know that our Fish and Wildlife Enforcement officers are monitoring some of that activity, but for the most part, it's more on the sale of wildlife and fish, specifically like sport fish things. So the aquatic invasive species hasn't quite dove into that, but yeah, it's a big concern and no one really has tackled it just yet. We're waiting for the final report from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which actually dived into some of the risks and they identified some of the hubs where these things are being distributed out of. So that would be a preliminary step. But yeah, it's going to be a huge undertaking to dive into that. But at least the mossballs has given us some better knowledge of how it all operates and connects and how we can start to tackle.
Yeah, it's a thorny question, and mossballs were definitely a wake-up call. I know for us, the first day that I saw an article about mossballs, I raced down to our local pet store to check if they were there, and yeah, we took it from there. But yeah, lots of lessons learned. Okay, well, we've got a few more minutes for people to enter in their questions if they have any more. There's another comment here just saying excellent talk, and I agree. Thank you so much, Nicole. But if folks don't have any other questions, then I will just finish by thanking you again, Nicole, for taking the time for this presentation. It was really informative. And also thank you to everyone who joined us online today. If you'd like to join us for our last webinar tomorrow, you can find more information on our website. That's nwtcispp.ca, or find us on Facebook by searching for NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens. We've got one more comment saying good job.
All right, thanks.
Thanks again, Nicole, and take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.